So, as mentioned earlier, the Giving It stage focuses on choosing what to teach and how to teach. Let's look briefly at all the possible whats that a second language teacher is responsible for teaching. The first thing, of course, is vocabulary. Without a vocabulary, a learner cannot communicate, whether that's through comprehension or production. The second component part would be pronunciation. Pronunciation is important particularly for beginner learners because until they feel comfortable with the new sounds of a language, they're not likely to want to take a risk and begin to speak. But pronunciation also becomes very important to the more advanced learner, as that learner wants to perfect his or her language ability. The third, and not surprising, would be grammar or structure. And this does not mean that you have to teach grammar outright with all of the terminology of grammar, but rather to make sure that you are teaching patterns and structures and helping the learners see those patterns and structures. Of course, as a learner becomes more advanced, one does need to learn all of those terminology for grammatical parts because one can't improve one's writing ability in particular without that knowledge. The third part that we would consider a type of input or giving it is culture. And we think of culture in two pieces, big C culture and little c culture. Others have called big C culture objective culture and little c culture subjective culture. That would refer to the work of Bennett. Overall, however, and over time, because the learning of culture is something that takes a long time to develop, we look at learning the history, the geography, the literature, the great artists, the historical roots of a culture, as well as the everyday lived culture, which contains particularly body language, gestures, the way that people interact, how close you would stand to someone. So culture is important. Another factor that will often facilitate learning is what's called language awareness, or knowledge about language. And this has a cross-linguistic element to it, meaning that when you can become aware of word order and the fact that the word order in the new language is different than the word order in your mother tongue, and just accept it as a fact, that will always facilitate learning. I'm sure you've all heard students say, "Why is this other language so stupid? It doesn't make sense." Well, it doesn't make sense because that learner is still thinking in his or her mother tongue, both in terms of vocabulary and word order. So language awareness is a way to bring that awareness of languages being different and helping the learner look at his or her own language and realize that for another learner, it might also appear just as ridiculous. We have to be conscious of functions of language. As learners begin to be aware that the learning process means not only learning words and grammar, but learning how language is used, they are much better able to accept other aspects of language. For example, if we took the phrase, "he is here," from a vocabulary and grammar perspective, it would be easy to analyze. If I put an exclamation mark at the end of that sentence, you would say,
"He's here."
And the function of language could be, "Oh, I'm so excited." Or let's change the function to a surprise using those same three words. What would it sound like?
"He's here."
Right. And so you see the same vocabulary and grammar serves a different function. If I put a question mark at the end of that sentence, that same three words, what would it sound like?
"He's here."
Right, so it could be surprise and it could be doubt. Okay, so we must teach learners about functions of language. In fact, it helps them realize that even with not so many words or grammar structures, they can function in many more settings. A very important part of giving it from a teacher perspective is classroom language. The learners must have opportunities to hear the language. And when the teacher is providing instructions or directions in the target language, the learners are really having much more exposure to the language. This is sometimes a tricky aspect of language to actually learn on the part of a teacher. And why would that be? Well, there are many reasons, but let's think of these two. First, as a second language learner, you may never have officially been taught classroom language. And unless you went to primary and public school in the learning of that language, you may not have had very much exposure to it. The second reason is that that classroom language resources are not typically available. So you're sort of stuck, how do you say this or how do you say that? If you're a native speaker, you may have a whole host of ways to say something. And in fact, your challenge then is to choose only one or two, to be consistent about how you say that with your beginner learners, and then to use that broader set of synonyms as your learners progress. When we talk about the giving it stage, we know that we have to teach the 4 skills. So we have to teach listening comprehension. We can't assume that it's going to happen by itself. We have to teach our students to speak. We have to teach them to become spontaneous. And we do that through structured activities and structured expectations. We have to teach students to read and all of the many skills associated with reading and with writing. And when we're talking about these skills, but all of these different aspects, we're dealing with the ongoing balance between fluency and accuracy. Fluency being comfort in the language, comfort trying to express oneself, trying to interpret and understand, and accuracy, which of course is refers to the correctness of the language. We're also interested in teaching forms. So just as we can look at vocabulary and grammar and how they come together, but in functions, they are through different functions of language. We have to realize that series of functions, series of sentences, come together in what we would call forms. So forms in oral language could be something like giving a self-introduction, or conducting an interview, or perhaps making an announcement. In written language, we are more comfortable looking at forms, and all we have to do is open a newspaper and count the number of forms. For example, the editorial page, the picture caption, the classified ads, the movie review. Each of those is an example of a written form or text type. At all times, we hope that we are not only teaching language, but that the learners are learning something new through the language. So we're going to call that content. And the more advanced the learner, or the longer the learner has been learning the language, the more we need to have content to keep them motivated. Probably the most important part of all of this is teaching and modeling a positive attitude. The teacher is in fact a representative of the language and culture of that group of people. And so that teacher is creating positive, we hope, first impressions for the learners of that language group and of the culture that it represents.